Okay, and as our roundtable panelists leave, I'm going to introduce our next roundtable, which is actually a live discussion of an asynchronous roundtable, and that is age-related myths in DIY toward a limitless all-ages ethos. And I'm happy to have some of our panelists here. Yes, Liz Pelly. Welcome, Liz. Um, I don't know if we've got Christopher Joseph Lee yet. I think maybe on his way. Maybe we'll find out. And NM Mashurov. I hope I've pronounced it right. Okay, great. So why don't we kick this off? And Liz, you're already unmiked. You can begin.
Hey, thank you for having us. And yeah, Neon is here today, and so am I, but unfortunately Chris is unable to make it. So we had recorded a 30-minute conversation regarding our own experiences within DIY music venues over the past decade, and Neon and Chris and I reflected a bit on the sorts of age-related myths that tend to permeate and inform those spaces. And yeah, I'm guessing some people have seen it, maybe you haven't, but if anyone has any questions they would want to ask about the discussion if they watched it, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, Neon and I can ask each other questions and reflect more on the talk.
Is there no questions just yet? So I would love to hear maybe the two of you just get started and give me your thoughts first, and then we can transition to some questions as they come in.
Sure. Neon, would you want to start, or wait, here I can.
Sure. Well, just maybe like to give a quick summary if people haven't watched it, but in our asynchronous discussion, we kind of ran through the spaces that we were a part of, and most of which were on the East Coast, like in New York and Boston, and they ranged from kind of house show spaces to the Silent Barn, which was an attempt to make like a legal, sustainable DIY space. And then Liz compiled a really great list of articles that mainstream media was writing about DIY spaces like these, and the kind of like terms that people use, which were, I don't remember off the top, but definitely something along the lines of like chaotic and like, I don't know, ungovernable, like messy, but let's had some good ones. But we were talking about how that methodology.
Bathrooms, disgusting, pungent bathrooms, chaotic, sort of these like terms that the mainstream media had used to mythologize DIY venues and characterize them as these free, like Neon said, sort of lawless spaces. Sorry.
Yeah. And so we were reflecting on how that myth like shapes the culture. And I think it is kind of a self-sustaining myth, and about how these spaces were super formative to us as young people and seemed formative to other young people entering the space, but then how lifers in these scenes and cultures are also really important, and how there's something that perpetuates like a kind of burnout that maybe keeps lifers out, etc. And also in the ways that youth is tied to precarity and like the expectation of precarity often. Like how, yeah, like living in a punk house with 8 people and one half functioning bathroom is like, that's a young person's game. But actually there's like a lot about kind of the systemic devaluation of art in like the United States, like art cultures and like music cultures that create those conditions. And so romanticizing them like is kind of harmful, and also like precludes all young people from joining, because there are young people that like can't handle things like that, honestly. I think it's very ableist in a way and exclusionary. Yes, I think that's most of what we ruminated about, right?
Yeah, it was sort of an interesting conversation because we started out talking about the self-perpetuating mythologies of DIY spaces, and because of the expectation of being able to exist within this, defunded, precarious state, who is allowed to participate in these spaces and who is not allowed to participate in these spaces. And it ended up being sort of a bigger conversation about the sort of way that the mainstream media mythologizes precarity in general. And Chris had some really interesting comments about, how racialized that often is and how it ties in with the way the mainstream media covers gentrification. And we talked about art washing and all of the different sort of intersecting inaccessibilities that DIY ends up upholding because of how underfunded these like spaces are and how underfunded the arts are in general in the United States. So if any of that sounds interesting, I'd definitely recommend checking out the video of the full talk.
Totally. And we were also definitely interested in, because our experience is so limited to like the specific East Coast kind of venue, like how this, like perpetuates like in other places in the US or outside of the US and such, because especially in New York, it's so tied with like the real estate, like housing bubble and crisis where like the Silent Barn was a space that was like mostly youth led, but the people in charge, whatever, in charge, like on the books were definitely necessarily a little older, along with other DIY spaces like Market Hotel or DIY space, et cetera, just because of what it takes to hold real estate in New York City. And I remember there were times where like I'd be in the yard and someone would be like, "This is crazy, we're running a Kansas City venue in New York." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, like this is not a sustainable thing." So like we were perpetually out of money. But it also has to do, we talked a little bit about this too, like how these spaces are necessarily used tied to like youth organizing, because so much of music venues is tied to alcohol sales and alcohol consumptions and like having to be over 21 to get into a place, and venues kind of devaluing that. Like if you pitch a show with a bunch of high school bands to a venue, they'll be like, well, no one's going to come to the bar, so no. So you kind of have to create those conditions for yourselves.
I think Karen Tungsten in the chat. Oh, I was saying she's forming a question, and here it is. So you can I'll read it out loud for everyone who isn't open, doesn't have the chat open. I know in the video you contextualize the fact that most of your experiences have been limited to the Northeast. I'm wondering what cross-pollination and collaboration there happens to be across regions, or is that nearly impossible? And it's just coming in, even though the fantasy that the internet makes everything more possible. I feel like I'm reading a telegram in the middle of
I think even more than the internet, it's like touring, and the way that these spaces like host the same kind of networks of touring bands is what I think has made that any kind of like cross-pollination and cross-inspiration possible, because I definitely think the experiences that I've like valued the most in those spaces is hosting bands from like Florida or like California or like New Mexico or like Ohio, etc. And then when we've gone on tour with people, getting to interact with those people and the spaces they have in their own towns. And actually, I think maybe there was one friend that came through and played, and then like sometimes people would go back and they'd be like, "Oh, we started a similar space in Sarasota," or like we started a similar space in Acadia, maybe Washington. There's definitely, and like we've definitely gained inspiration from like spaces in like Tennessee, etc. So I think that's one network. Yeah.
They're also, interestingly, towards the end of the Silent Barn project, I feel like there's this beginning to develop relationship between Silent Barn and DIY Space for London. I actually have this card on my wall right now that's signed by all these people from DIY Space for London that they punk mailed to the Silent Barn. And I think that those, like, spaces, we were able to look to each other for some sort of inspiration. Unfortunately, that space just shut its doors during the pandemic as well. But there was definitely some sort of conversation like that. And in the talk, I spoke about how personally inspiring to me the All Ages Movement Project book In Every Town was, in sort of conceptualizing a legal version of the All Ages ethos, and learning about spaces around the country that were taking the all ages DIY approach to running a music venue and trying to make it more long lasting and sustainable. And I think, that book came out 10 years ago, but I think that the model that it showed of sort of taking all of the lessons of DIY spaces. It was essentially this book that this organization put together that profiled all of these different all ages DIY spaces, and showed what types of models they were using. And I really continue to take inspiration from that idea of sort of democratizing the information necessary to create these spaces, versus, you know, in the talk, we touched on how so often so much of saving DIY, or saving all ages spaces boils down to like a GoFundMe for one specific space, and how much power there is in trying to grow the ideas that are required to uphold this way of making space versus just focusing on like the short term fundraising efforts of individual spaces, even though those are also really important as well. I think you need to like do both. Like it's like space survival and then also growing the culture that allows these spaces to thrive.
I also really love in that book how it lays bare some of the lore, like how the So-So Glows hung out with the P.S. Eliot Waxahachie swearing twins in like Tennessee and got inspired by Cave Nine and went back to New York and started the Market Hotel. And that's, I think, something that people don't talk about enough, but it's like so many of these New York spaces are based off of spaces in every town. Or like Gilman was like super inspiring, I think, to a lot of, especially like punk spaces, like the ABC Rio Gilman relationship.
Neon and Liz, can you respond to Chi-Chi's question? Have you considered alternative venues like stores that stay open late to throw DIY shows like bookstores, vintage clothing stores? And I actually think it, in some ways, probably even connects to Carl's question, which is related to A Song for a New Day, Sarah Pinsker's great book from 2019 about imagining DIY spaces rising up clandestinely in a society under kind of permanent pandemic lockdown. So just also thinking about COVID and how it's changing the ways that you know, some of this stuff is going to have to show up.
Yes, both of those topics are covered in our panel discussion recording. You know, we in the talk, Neon, Chris, and I, we actually all met throwing shows in a bookstore in Boston where there would be shows at night. And in the talk, I talked about how like that was really my introduction to booking shows collectively. And Chris worked at that bookstore and like reflects on that experience and a little bit more. And then Neon, maybe you'd want to summarize like in some of the connections that we made in the talk about how because of COVID, like we all, I think one of my favorite quotes from the panel was Chris talking about how we all live in DIY now because of the proliferation of mutual aid.
Definitely. And also to add another detail to that, one of the last shows, I mean, I'm in California now, one of the last shows that I helped throw in New York before leaving was in a clothing store that is also a venue. And I think just something that's really important about those is when you have something that's like a bookstore, a clothing store, and not an above ground venue, you kind of have to compromise less on your programming because there's other revenue streams for keeping the space afloat, which I think is important because it's like towards the end of Silent Barn, there was definitely like, okay, we can throw like the all ages, like folk punk shows, but also we have to throw like a big rock show where people will drink a lot so the bar makes money. And it's like at the clothing store and bookstore, like that's not part of the revenue stream. So I think that's a super important model. And then as far as COVID goes, we were talking about that too, because after Silent Barn shut down, we were like, okay, so like, what are the kids doing? Like, what are the other spaces? Are we just like too old and we haven't heard about them? And the kids were like, no, like we're not really doing that right now. We're like, oh, but we're talking about how so much mutual aid projects are youth driven and there's like youth leading protests or leading like a lot of like more activist efforts and how I think part of our DIY projects was always like sort of making that connection and like having fundraisers and like raising money for bail funds and like having people table. And it was kind of that model of having like music as a way to like activate and like radicalize like community potential to fundraise and to kind of like do mutual aid support, and how now it seems like a lot of people are doing that sort of directly, which is really awesome. But how I think like, or Chris said this is sort of phrasing Chris's awesome point, but like how there is still that romanticization of it, right? Where it's like, oh, you're all doing mutual aid, like that's so cool. And it's like, well, yeah, but also like people should be taken care of. Like we shouldn't have to be doing this project and like this volunteer, like what, yeah.
I think something Chris said was everyone's like, oh, like it's so cool to go buy groceries for your neighbors now, but actually the reason why you have to go buy groceries for your neighbors is because of the failures of the state. And when you think about the precariousness that exists in society right now and how we're all swooping in with these like ad hoc DIY makeshift mutual aid projects, like ultimately it's because the resources aren't there because the state doesn't care to provide them. And I thought that that was a really interesting context within which, to think about the precarity that all ages music venues exist within. Like when you think about the how unsafe they often are as well. Like they're unsafe because there isn't funding for all ages movements and because the arts are so devalued in this country. So I thought that that was like a interesting connection there.
Yeah, super important connection. Yeah, thank you for seeing that point exactly. And also to kind of add something to Carl's point is that I've been following a bunch of people from like The Glove, which is another DIY space that closed. And I think I go back and forth in this a lot because it is important to have a permanent space that people can come to, that people can just show up to and like find community and like find stuff happening. And I think that is really important. But then also you get bogged down navigating like code and navigating like plumbing, I don't know, and finding ways for it to not be a fire hazard. Like you just get stuck in all the like daily maintenance. And I think especially with COVID, now that inside spaces like are not really safe to be in other ways as well, I've seen a lot of people just kind of like throwing ad hoc sidewalk shows or doing kind of things like that are like, socially distant, like handing out masks and stuff. And I think when you don't have a physical space, there is like more ways to adapt, which I think is also reflective of mutual aid efforts because mutual aid like responds to the need at hand instead of having necessarily a static model. So I think I've always appreciated that about DIY is like the elasticity of it.
We've got only a few minutes left, so if there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Are either of you going to continue thinking about this work or doing more work in relationship to this? This is my question to Liz and Leon.
I think so. We both were involved in all ages show booking for years before the Silent Barn, and the Silent Barn shut down in 2018. And it was, something we talked about in our talk a lot was the extent of the burnout that often is experienced when you sort of like throw yourself into these projects and there's this sort of like pressure to be there at the gig every night, like it's your whole life. And we talked about how that pressure and that burnout often, it also is part of what makes these spaces very inaccessible to people that have different responsibilities in their lives, and how that is one of the things that is a sort of issue that needs to be resolved in order to make all ages spaces more accessible to folks of all ages, in addition to all of the other types of factors that make the spaces inaccessible. But yeah, I think that since 2018, there was like a couple of years of sort of being reflecting, and I think the reflection on the Silent Barn project will probably be a lifelong process of learning. But I think that, I'm excited to figure out ways to be involved in this type of work, whether it's in the form of a space or just incorporating the lessons into show booking in general. Definitely the lessons that were learned about what does and doesn't work about collective organizing, I think also are things that will be applicable in the future as well.
Definitely. And like I know Liz was booking shows in other spaces for a while after Silent Barn closed, and I was booking like readings and such, although at a much more sustainable pace. I mean, yeah, and I was a part of Silent Barn for like 6 years, and I was like, I can't hold down a full-time job or like really a hard part-time job because I have to be at the show every day. And like it was a need, like, because if I wasn't, the show wouldn't run, or if Liz wasn't, etc. And I think there's definitely a lot of burnout from that. But I don't know. I feel like we're both lifers in a lot of ways. Like, I don't know if I'd be involved in that capacity again, or if it's possible to be involved in that capacity. But especially with COVID, like that's the thing that I miss the most right now is just like putting together a show, like booking a show. I think I was actually in the process of trying to book Liz's band a show on the West Coast at the Che Cafe, which is another all ages space that's undergrad run on the UCSD campus, which is where I'm at now. And we were like almost had that booked, and then COVID happened, and I was like, the show, it's like definitely something I'm looking forward to hopefully being a part of in some capacity again.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Neon, by in absentia, Chris. Please take a look at the asynchronous video, which is up on the Mopop site. Thank you for your time today. We're going to now take a 10-minute break before the next panel. Thank you both.
Thank you for moderating and people for asking questions.
Thank you.